today that I felt like was not for baby Christians, not for everybody even, but I'm going to leave out a whole bunch of stuff that God spoke to me all week about this. In Exodus 32 and 33, it's the story of Moses interceding before God for the Israelites. Most of us are familiar with the story, how Moses had gone up on the mountain, received the 10 Commandments. While he was up there, the people got tired of waiting, got worried and anxious, and thought, well, he went up on the, I mean, you can understand it, is they saw Moses go up on this mountain that was covered with smoke.
Yes.
And when the mountain itself was shaking and quivering, and the people were scared of the mountain. In fact, they told Moses, they said, don't let us get close to that. And God said, okay, just keep your distance. But Moses went up there. So you can imagine how scared the people were, because Moses was the one that led them out of Egypt. Moses was the one that held his staff out over the Red Sea, and it opened up and they walked across and then and watched the Egyptian army be wiped out by God's power, all because of Moses. So these people had followed Moses, and yet they watched this leader, that they're, in a sense, their savior, go up on this mountain that was covered with smoke. It was not unlike the disciples must have felt when they saw Jesus get crucified, because it was something they couldn't understand. And Moses was up there for 40 days, and after a few days, the people started thinking, well, he might have died up there. I mean, they were afraid already, and so watching him disappear up into this holy, smoking, quivering, shaking mountain, I'm sure it was real easy for the murmuring and the people began to question and say, where is he? He's probably never coming back. He led us out into this wilderness, and here we are. We got no leader. We got no means of support. We don't have a destination. We don't know where we're going. We don't know what we're supposed to do. And you can imagine the confusion and so they came to Aaron and they said, look, we think Moses is dead. We don't think he's coming back. I mean, where have you heard that before? We think God is dead. We don't think he's coming back because it's been 2,000 years now and we haven't seen any sign of him. So maybe he's just not coming. And so they said, we need to figure out, we got to pick out a new leader. And Aaron made the calf. They put all their gold and jewelry into a fire pot and melted it down. And then Aaron made an idol for it, and the people all worshipped it and said, hey, this is our new leader.
Oh, wow.
It sounds like 2026 to me, with the crazy stuff that's going on in the world. And so Moses, God sent Moses back down. It's interesting, in the beginning of chapter 32, God told Moses, and this was, I think these two chapters are maybe one of the most intense conversations between a man and God in the entire Bible. Probably for sure in the Old Testament. I think when you get into the garden with Jesus and God, that conversation was really intense. But the conversation between Moses and God here is one of the most amazing stories and the most intense conversations, I think, in the entirety of God's Word. And God told Moses, he said, you need to go back down there. He said, the people you brought out of Egypt are rebelling. And I can't imagine what Moses must have thought when God told him that. Because Moses never wanted to bring the people out of Egypt. Remember at the burning bush? When God told Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt. I want you to tell the people of Israel, I'm going to remember Moses' attitude was that, God, get somebody else.
Yeah.
Get somebody else. I don't speak well. I've already been kicked out of Egypt once for insurrection, and if I go back there, they're probably going to kill me if the people of Israel even respond to me. And Moses, he didn't want the job. And so here he is. He finally, he went through the whole thing with Pharaoh and the plagues, and and sort of getting the people to come together and literally to rebel against the. I mean, it was a big deal. And now here he is out on this mountain with God, and God says, those people you brought out of Egypt are rebelling, and you need to go down there and straighten them out. And then God said, he said, I'm so disgusted and mad at them that I'm just going to strike them all dead, and I'm going to start all over, and I'm going to raise up a new nation and make your name great. And Moses, amazingly, because I think a lot of us, had we been in that situation, if God were to come to us and say, hey, I want to elevate you into a position of greatness and superiority, most of us would say, okay, great, just kill whoever you need to put me in that spot. But Moses said, no, God. He said, you can't do that. Yeah. He said, your name is at stake here. Yes. And what I'm saying is Moses' attitude about this was intercession for a group of people that most of the time he was mad at. Right. Because there's other places in the Bible where Moses told God, he says, why don't you just wipe them all out and start all over? Because it seemed like God and Moses sort of went back and forth. It was a lot like Cindy and I. It's like our relationship, one of the things that makes it strong is usually when I'm discouraged, she's up. And when she's discouraged, I'm up. So we lift each other up all the time. And if you get that feeling, that's kind of how God and Moses operated. When God was ready to wipe them all out, Moses said, oh, we got to put the brakes on here, God, we can't do that. Your name is too important. And then when Moses was like, God, I'm just so tired of these complaining and murmuring, and why don't you just wipe them all out? And God said, no, Moses, we can't do that. But Moses' attitude was one of intercession. Now, the thing is, Moses didn't understand this, and this is important for today in this room. Moses didn't understand at this point that he was not interceding for himself. He was interceding for a generation that it had yet to come on the scene. Moses at this point was 80 years old. He's an old man. And Moses, most of the people that came out of Egypt were younger than Moses. And he was the old man of the group, and we know that eventually everyone, when they got to the promised land the first time, and the 10 spies went in, and the people voted not to go do what God said. God said, okay, you don't want to follow me, I'm just going to wipe out I'm going to let this whole generation die off, and I'm going to wait 40 years, and I'm going to bring your kids in. Moses didn't understand it, but that was the generation that he was interceding for. And so Moses went down in chapter 32, and he got the people sort of straightened out, and had to actually had to kill a bunch of them. There was a plague that went through and wiped out some of the troublemakers, and then Moses comes back to meet with God. Now, I've always read this story, but there's a part of it that I always read wrong, because I always thought this conversation that God and Moses had next was up on the mountain. It wasn't. If you read the story, you'll find out it talks about the fact that Moses, they had erected a tent for Moses to go meet with God that was outside the camp. It was far enough outside the camp that all the people, you can imagine, is like 3 million people are camping out in the desert. They would all sort of build or put their tents up in a group, sort of like a circle, or it was an organized thing. They did it by structure and so forth. But it was a camp. It was a whole, like a little miniature tent city that they would set up, and then Moses had this other tent that he would set up that was outside of the camp. It was far enough outside of the camp that all the people from inside the camp could look out there, and they'd see this tent that was sitting way out in the desert all by itself. And so when Moses would go out and talk to God, or when God wanted to talk to Moses, he would call him out there, which, by the way, this was one of the most unique things that ever happened. This never ever happened like this again. There was never a prophet that the entire nation of Israel would watch go talk to God. And God would invite him out to this tent, and Moses would go out there, and when Moses would start to walk out to the tent, the word would quickly spread through the camp. Moses is going to talk to God. I mean, I don't know how they said it. Maybe they just said Moses is going to the tent. And the word would spread. And so all the people would stand in their own tents, in their own little city, and they would all watch as Moses would walk out to this tent, and then he would go into this tent and he would talk to God. It was in this tent that Moses had this conversation with God. And it's one of the craziest stories in the Bible. And it says in verse 11, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp. We're in chapter 33.
Thank you.
That was verse 11.
Okay, thank you.
So Moses says to God in verse 12, you've been telling me lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You said, I know you by name and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your way so I may know you and continue to find favor with me. Remember that this nation is your people. God had told Moses, he said, look at these people. I can't handle them. I can't handle their complaining, their murmuring, their rebellion. It's like one thing after another. He says, I'm so upset with them. And I remember this is God talking. And the one person in the world you do not want upset with you is God. And God said, you know what? He says, you already talked me into not destroying them all. But I'm going to tell you what, Moses, I can't handle it anymore. I'm afraid if I stay with you, I'm going to kill them all. He says, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you away from here, and I'm going to send an angel ahead of you to bring you into the promised land and get you where I said you would go. And Moses tells God in this meeting in the tent, he said, that's God, he said, I don't even know the angel's name. And you told me that you were going to stay with me. You told me that you know me. And I know you. I don't know the angel. And so Moses told God, he said, if you're not going to go with us, then don't send us away from here. He said this, he said, how else are the people going to know that how else is the rest of the world going to know that we're your people? What's going to set us apart? What's going to make us different than every other nation in the world? Moses reminded God, he said, you said we are your chosen people. We are your separated people. We are the people of Kadosh. That word we just learned. The holy people. Not that we're perfect. Not that we're better than everybody else. In some ways, we might not be as good as anybody else. But we are your chosen people. We've been called to be different, to be separated, to live differently. That word is so important.
Yes.
Because we spend our whole life trying to be holy. Because we didn't understand the word. Trying to live better, trying to not screw up, whatever. But God is saying, you just need to understand that I am so far different than you. A difference that we can't explain. A difference that we can't understand. It's one of the world's favorite things to do in their argument about believing in God, is they want us to prove who he is. They want us to explain. If you can explain exactly who God is and how he operates and why he operates and why he does the things he does, then I'll come over to your side. And they don't understand that the key to knowing God is not to understand him, but to understand Kadosh, to understand that he is holy, that he is separate, he's different, he's so far above us that we can't possibly understand him. And so Moses reminds God that he said, you promised that you would go with us. He said in verse 16, how will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? The Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name. Folks, that's intercession right there. Yes. Moses interceding for a group of people that sometimes he didn't even like. Sometimes that he himself wanted God to erase. But Moses told God, he said, if you're not going to keep your word to these people, he said, then blot my name out of the book. And God said, okay, I'll do it. Now understand something. When you read this story, it sounds very much like Moses is trying to change God's mind. Can't do it. That God had a plan, and because of Moses, God changed his plan. That is not what happened. What actually was happening was God was bringing Moses into a place of agreement with him. Because it was never God's plan to forsake his people. It was never God's plan to forsake you and I. God promised he would never do that. He would never forsake his people. And so what God was doing was he was bringing Moses into a place of agreement. That's what intercession is. Intercession isn't us changing God's mind or changing God's plan. Unfortunately, a lot of us have gotten into the habit of thinking that praying to God is getting God to line up with our plans. Now, you can do that if you want. The problem is that your plan, to put it in the vernacular of today, your plan sucks. Because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know what you're going to need. And God has a far better plan. And what we need to do in our prayer life, and what we need to do as intercessors, is we need to learn to come into agreement with his plan. Prayer isn't getting God to line up with our plan. It is us coming into agreement and aligning ourselves with his plan. Yes. Even when you don't understand it. Even when things happen that you think, wow, this doesn't look good. And so Moses lined up with God's plan and said, okay, now what actually God was saying to Moses is, okay, I'll do what you asked because you finally started asking for what I wanted all along. And so God tells Moses, verse 17, I will do the very thing you have asked because I am pleased with you and I know you by name. Then Moses makes that amazing statement in verse 18. He says, then Moses said, now, show me your glory. As far as I know, it's the only man in the Bible that ever asked God that. Now, a lot of times when we read that word glory, because we want to see God's glory, right? Yes. Well, a lot of times what we think of, it's a lot like what we just learned about the word holy. Is there's a depth to that word, there's a meaning to that word that we don't understand. That word is, both of those words have sort of been bastardized. They've been over the centuries, they've sort of been translated into something different. And a lot of times when we talk about the glory of God and we think about Moses asking God to show me your glory, we're thinking, oh, Moses wanted to see the amazing light show. to see God on the throne, because it talks about how in Revelation, when John saw Jesus on the throne, you remember that? He talked about how he was glowing and he looked like he was on fire, and there was fire coming out of his eyes, and his hair was silver, and there was like lightning and this big amazing light show that sort of surrounded the throne. The same thing we see when Ezekiel saw the glory of God, when it would come into the temple, and the amazing display that it was there. A lot of times we think, oh, that's the glory that Moses wanted to see. But the word actually in the Hebrew is kabod. And what it actually means is that what Moses was actually asking for was he said, I want to see your, it's more like the weight of you, or the heaviness of you, the like the power of your presence. And I thought about that today, because as we started to worship, and as we walked into the room, there was a weightiness in the room. There was a heaviness in the room. There was a presence of God. And it wasn't the earth wasn't shaking, and there wasn't smoke and fire and lightning bolts and all of the things that we sort of think about when we think about the glory of God. But there was a weightiness in the room, and it's still here. And that's what Moses was asking for. He said, God, I need to see the power of you. I need to see the weight of your glory. And so Moses, God said this in verse 19. The Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I never saw that part before. God said, okay, Moses, I'm going to give you what you want. Remember, this is all taking place in the tent. Now, what's going to happen after this is God's going to take Moses back up on the mountain. And he's going to tell Moses, okay, I have a place. It's right next to me, and he says, I'm gonna let you stand on the rock, and then when I walk by, there's going to be a cleft in the rock, or this little like crack in the rock, and he says, what I'm going to do is I'm gonna put you in that cleft. I'm gonna have you face the rock, because if you see my face, it'll kill you. But as I pass by, I'm going to let you come out from the cleft, and I'm going to let you look at the back side of me and experience this weightiness of God. So this was all going to take place up on the mountain, but this conversation is still in the tent. And Moses is asking God, he says, I want to feel, I want to know, I want to experience the weightiness of you, the power of you. I need that, because you're sending me on this journey, and if we're going to be your people, I need to know the fullness of you. Yeah. And so God says, first off, he says, I'm going to cause all my goodness to pass in front of you. He says, and then I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. When I read that verse earlier in the week, and then God started to speak this word to me, he said, this is what's getting ready to happen. Right now, God is raising up a generation of warriors. He's raising up a generation that is going to we're going to see the greatest revival, the greatest turning, the greatest harvest of souls that we've ever seen. And one of the things that needs to happen is that this generation, these young people that God is raising up, they need to hear the voice of God proclaim his name. Part of what Moses was told, what God told Moses, he said, I'm going to cause my goodness to pass by you, but then also I am going to proclaim my name in your presence. God told Moses that in order for Moses to understand and know the glory of God and to see the glory of God, he was going to literally hear God proclaim his own name. And what God spoke to me, he said, there's a generation that is going to hear me proclaim my name in that generation. In the book of Isaiah, it talks about the prophetic word from Isaiah was there was going to come a generation where God was going to basically take over, and he was going to raise up, and he was going to cause this harvest. And I believe we're living in that generation. And I believe that there's a generation of young people that God is getting ready to speak his name to. I think we're starting to see it in the world even now. I think we're starting to see. I was watching the news last night, and I saw this news segment, and they were talking about the fact that there's been this uptick in young men who are coming back to the church. They're coming back, and the news, as I was watching it, the people that were talking about it, it seemed like to me that they didn't really know God that well. So they didn't really understand what was going on in the spirit realm, and they were trying to describe something that was happening in the physical realm in the terminology and how they saw it. And so they were talking about how there's been, the data shows that there's like a high percentage of young men who are coming back to the church. And they were trying to explain it away on the news, and they had these different explanations. And I wanted to step inside the TV and say, this is what's going on. The Spirit of God is moving. The Spirit of God is drawing people to him because there's no real reasonable explanation for what's going on. Sunshine, there's no real reasonable explanation for what's going on in your life right now. Except that God reached inside of you and he pulled you out of the mess that was your life. And he set your feet on a rock. And he's doing something remarkable. And don't be confused by the liar who's going to tell you you're not holy enough. You're not good enough to walk in this glory, in this power. Because what I'm telling you is God is getting ready to speak his name in your generation. Amen. You're going to be one of those ones that is going to hear the voice of God. Amen. I never saw this before in this story. But part of Moses experiencing the glory of God, the heaviness, the weightiness of God, and this move of God, that this generation needed going forward to get into the promised land. Moses, I don't think, understood. He was an 80-year-old man, and I think Moses at this point was still anticipating and thinking, one of these days I'm going to walk into the promised land ahead of the children of Israel. These people that I went and basically rescued from slavery and bondage, and God has brought them out of Egypt, and now here we are, we're on this mountain, and God has given us this covenant, and he said that he is going to take care of us, he's going to lead us. And I think Moses at this point thought for sure, he pictured himself walking ahead of them into the promised land, and he didn't know that he himself was never going to set foot in the promised land. He didn't understand that he was making intercession, that he was asking God for something more that no one else had ever asked for, to see God's glory, to experience the heaviness, the weightiness, the power of God in his life, because he was going to transfer that. He was going to be the sort of the one that protected them and kept this generation who was in its infancy at this point. All of the generation that was getting ready to enter the promised land, they were still kids at this point. They had no say-so in the affairs of the world. They were probably, many of them weren't even born yet. Because they still had another 40 years of walking around the wilderness, and all of those men and women that were down in the camp at that point, that Moses thought that he was interceding for, and he thought, yeah, we're going to take this journey. It's only maybe a month or two. We're going to go there, and then we're going to walk into the promised land, and we're going to see God's presence and his glory all along the way, because God had explained to Moses how he was going to drive out the inhabitants of the land, and he was going to protect them and keep them. And Moses knew that it was going to be a hard journey, but he was fully expecting it to be just a short amount of time, and that he himself would lead the people triumphantly into the promised land. What he didn't know was that he was interceding for a generation that was yet to be born. And here's what God is speaking to us today. There's many of us in this room that are, let's just say, we're advanced in years. And we've lived our whole life waiting to see the return, waiting to see God pour his Spirit out. And many of us have pictured ourselves sort of being in the like sort of the forefront and leading this nation, leading this country, leading this world back to Jesus. And now here it is, and we're all old, and we're all like in the Moses generation. And what we're seeing happen is happening in a generation that most of us can't even barely comprehend. We don't understand them. They do and say weird things, like all generations. But God has brought us to the tent today. And he's inviting us to intercede, to stand before him. Just like Moses stood before God and the nation of Israel. God said, I want to wipe them all out. I want to kill them all. And Moses by himself stood in front of God and said, God, you can't do that. That goes against what you promised. And God is asking, and he's inviting us today to seek his glory, to seek the weightiness of him, to seek the power of him. But here's the thing, it's not for us. Ezekiel 22:30, one of the most discouraging verses in the Bible. Ezekiel said this, he said, I sought for a man among them that would stand before me, that would make up the gap. God is speaking in Ezekiel 22:30. He says, I was looking for a man, somebody to stand up between me and the land, that I might not destroy it. But I found none. And I believe with all my heart what God is saying to us today. He says, I'm looking for a man or a woman that will stand before me, that will intercede, not for ourselves, not for our generation, but for a generation that is just now coming into its place. God's looking for a Moses. He's looking for a man or a woman or men and women that will say, God, I'm not really interested in making a name for myself. I'm more interested in your will being done. Moses faced the same temptation that Jesus would face. When Jesus first started his ministry, remember, he went out in the desert with the liar, and the liar tried to trick him 3 different times. And what did he do? He offered him fame and fortune. He offered him an easy way out. The liar told Jesus, he says, look, you don't have to go through that whole crucifixion thing. You don't have to go through that whole deal where you take on the whole sins of the world. He said, I'll give you what you want. I'll give you a great name. I'll give you all of the nations of the world. I'll give you, because that's what was promised to Jesus by his Father. 3 different times Jesus quoted scripture back at him and said, sorry, you're talking about something that goes against the will of the Father. And that's exactly the same temptation Moses faced. And Moses said, I'm not interested in me becoming great. I'm interested in seeing the name of God be lifted up. I'm interested in seeing God's promise be kept. And I believe with all my heart, God is looking for men and women of our generation that will stand up and will intercede and will have the courage to ask God to see his glory, to stand in his presence, to go where nobody else is going. You ever wonder what it was like to be Moses? He had nobody to counsel with. He had nobody to ask. Whenever things were going south and whenever things weren't working right, whenever the people were on the cusp of rebellion and it looked like everything was going sideways, Moses had nobody else to look to and say, hey, what do I do in this situation? That's the kind of person God's looking for. Somebody who is willing to go before God and not be bothered and not be concerned about what man thinks. I was watching this news clip and they were explaining how they talked about how these young men are coming back to religion. Now I understand they don't know God, so that what else can they say? They think God is religion. They don't understand what's going on in the spirit realm. They don't understand that these young men aren't coming to religion. They're coming to Jesus. Yes. They're coming to truth. They're looking for something real in their life. And there's a spirit that's stirring them. There's a spirit that's drawing them. There's something going on in the spirit realm that the world knows nothing about. And so when they see the manifestation of what's going on in the spirit realm, they have to explain it with the language of the world. And so they look at it and think, oh, it's just all these young people are going to church. And it's just like this weird sort of anomaly. They can't really explain why it's happening. They try to, but it's not really explaining what's going on. And as I was watching this segment and how they were talking about how all these young men, that's what intrigued me. It was young men that are coming back to Jesus. Because my whole life, what I've noticed is that it's been the women that have been the ones that have sort of clung to God, and the men have sort of disappeared from their leadership role. And so what we're seeing is these young men who are coming back to Jesus. They talked about like, well, they're just going back to the church. And as I was watching it, I thought the church right now, when I call it the church, I'm talking about the religious organization that we think of as the church. There's like thousands of them. There's all different flavors and different sizes and kinds. There's Catholics and Protestants and Baptists and Methodists and Free Methodists and Presbyterians and Pentecostals and on and on and on and on. Lutherans, I don't mean to leave anybody out. There's too many of them.
Orthodox.
And then there's these subdivisions of those. Like there's 100 different kinds of Baptists, and then there's 100 different kinds of Methodists, and so forth and so on. And so we've got all these religious organizations, and that's what the world thinks of when you say church. Well, it's not wrong to call that the church, but there's another kind of a church. The ecclesia, the body, the bride of Christ. And that's the part that's what the world, they don't understand, that these young men are not coming just back to the religious institution. They're coming back to the truth. They're coming back to the Savior. And our part in this, What God is calling us to today is, are we willing to stand in the gap, to protect these young people, to protect this generation that is going to do and say and hear things that you and I have never done, said, or heard. Yes. It's going to be the sound of God pronouncing his name, declaring his name. That doesn't mean that God's going to stand up on the mountain someplace and speak his name. He's going to literally stamp his identity on this generation. We talk all the time. God talks to me all the time about releasing the sound. One of the first things we did here 7.5 years ago, we stood in this living room, and we stood right here, and there's only 6 or 7 of us, and we all stood in a circle, back to back, looking out, and we released the sound. God told us to do it. I had no idea what it meant. I didn't know what we were doing, but what we were doing is we were releasing the sound of God speaking his own name. Yes. And what we are seeing right now is the beginning of that. There's a sound that's being released. There's a sound that is going out. It's sort of like a dog whistle. You know what that is? It's a whistle that only a dog can hear. Somehow, I don't understand the science, but somehow dogs can hear a different type of sound than human beings can. That's why a lot of times if you have a dog and it doesn't like thunderstorms, when it starts getting cloudy and you don't hear anything, your dog starts going crazy. Potter goes crazy all the time, so he's different. But you ever had a dog that did that, where all of a sudden it'll just start acting weird? A lot of times it's because he's hearing something that we can't hear. Yeah. It has something to do with decibels or frequency. That's the word I'm looking for. I don't understand how it works, but that sound is sort of like a dog whistle. Only those who are called by God are going to hear that sound. It's going to be the sound of God speaking his name. Because when Moses went up on the mountain, he stood on the rock. And as God's presence came closer, God finally put him face into the cleft of the rock. Had to feel weird for Moses. Almost like he was being punished, maybe. You ever, I don't know, do we still put kids in the corner? We used to. Do you do it? Every once in a while you tell them to go stand in the corner? I remember when I was a kid, my dad and mom, they spanked, so I never had to stand in the corner at home. I wish I could have stood in the corner. That would have been pleasant compared to what I got. But my grandparents, they didn't spank me, but if I misbehaved when I was at Grandma's house, every once in a while she'd make me go stand in the corner. You ever have to stand in the corner? You probably should have. Probably more than once. But I can remember being told, and you know, grandmas being grandmas, it was only like 3 minutes before they would relent, because it wasn't their job to punish grandkids. But it was almost like, I wonder if Moses felt like he was I don't know what he felt like. But here he was, he's got his face in the corner where he can't see anything. And I wonder what it was like to feel or to know that the God of heaven, the power of God, the kabod of God, was passing directly behind him. And then once he was passed, God pulled him out so that he could sense that power. I'll be honest with you. I don't know what that feels like, but I want to know. We sensed a little bit of it here today. I believe God has more for us. I believe God wants us to come into his presence and be willing to ask him to show us, to speak his name, so that we understand the power of God. And maybe, like Moses, we'll be will be one of those ones. That knows the glory of God. Moses never saw the he saw the promised land, but he never stepped foot in it. He never experienced the fulfillment of what he thought he was going to experience. But the next generation, in fact, it was probably 2 or 3 generations that he was interceding for. That was the generation that crossed the Jordan River, that marched around Jericho, that saw the walls collapse. They were the ones that defeated the city of Ai. They were the ones that once they got into the promised land, spread out. Never again would there be a prophet like Moses that the entire nation of Israel would watch him go into the tent and communicate face to face with God. There was one part in this story that I left out. Remember when it talked about Moses going into the tent? In verse 11, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp. Here's the part I left out. But his young aide, Joshua, did not leave the tent. The whole time Moses was communicating with God, the man that God was raising up, that was training to bring the nation of Israel into the promised land. One of 2 men of that generation that would actually enter into the promised land, Joshua and Caleb. Joshua, the whole time that Moses was communicating with God and was having this amazing conversation, this